In September 1944, Allied forces liberated Belgium, with the Irish Guards in the thick of the action advancing to Brussels. Belgium had been overrun by German forces in 1940 and had endured about 5 years of incredible hardship and occupation. The National Army there had all but ceased to exist, and at the time a decision was made to form a brand new army, a so-called Free Belgian Army. A 1st Infantry Brigade was already in operation by late 1944. They were the first of 6, and they had played a role in the liberation of their country, but more recruits would be needed, and that's what we'll hear about tonight. So I am Scott from WartimeNI, and I'm delighted to be back here at the Irish Linen Centre and Lisburn Museum. This is my 3rd time speaking here, each time on a brand new subject, and I have got a lot to get through tonight. So I will spare you all the full introduction. If you want to find out more about me or what it is that I do, you can visit WartimeNI.com. One thing I will say is that sometimes I get a critique for not looking professional enough, and I like my flat cap, and I don't like wearing a shirt. But this t-shirt tonight is actually quite special, because WartimeNI have designed 5 different t-shirts to represent each of the 5 Belgian brigades to mark the 80th anniversary. And you can go on WartimeNI and you can have a look through them, and I can see actually one being worn in the audience already, so that's good to see. And they've got the name of the brigade, the locales that they were in, so there aren't many t-shirts out there that have Caledon and Dungannon on them, but I'm wearing one right now. And if you want to look it up and see if there's one close to where you live, you can have a look at that on the website. But back to Belgium. The formation of 5 new infantry brigades took place in Belgium between January and June 1945. The 2nd Brigade, Ulster, was formed in January 1945. The 3rd, called Rumbeek, and the 4th, Steenstraate, were formed in March in the regions of Oudenaarde and Mons, and all 3 of these brigades were made up of volunteers. The 5th was called Merkem, which it says on my t-shirt. It was formed in May, and the 6th, Deinze, who eventually would be in Lisburn, was formed in the area around Brachet in the month of June. Now, the last 2 brigades were a mix of volunteers and militiamen of the class of 1941. So those were non-commissioned officers and officers who had trained in the UK during the Second World War. From Belgium, all of these men would embark on a long journey to Northern Ireland. But in their respective locales, they began rudimentary training, learning first the basics of military life, and then from a transit camp in Ostend, it was onward by ship to Dover, Harwich or Tilbury, and then a long train journey up to the west coast of Scotland, from where an Irish sea crossing would land them in Belfast. The choice of Northern Ireland was due to the fact that it was the only place where adequate facilities were available. In Belgium, many of the military barracks were occupied by the Allies, but in Ulster, all the required infrastructure that had served as camps for the American units was now available. So we'll go back a little bit to how we got here. So we'll look at some of the historical context. When the first officers and soldiers of the Belgian Irish Brigades, as they called themselves, arrived in Ulster in 1945, it was actually the continuation of a really deep historic connection between the 2 lands. One had only to look back 5 years to the spring and summer of 1940. Engaging in the so-called Phoney War, 2nd Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles were one of many local battalions in France and Belgium as the Nazis swept through Europe. There too was 1st Battalion Royal Irish Fusiliers, and they were first tasked with the defence of Brussels, a role which quickly adapted into fighting the rear guard during the evacuation and retreat to Dunkirk. Just across the border in northern France, 3rd Ulster Searchlight Regiment were among those in the action. With the Searchlight Regiment was a man called Charles Scotty Lawson, not Charlie Lawson from Coronation Street, and not even an ancestor of his, I'm sad to say. But he was a Scotsman. He was a much-loved figure around County Armagh. He was an incredible musician, an all-around entertainer, and please don't boo this, but he was a former goalkeeper of Portadown Football Club. He, like many at the time, was keen to get into the action, and he wrote home to the Portadown Times newspaper on the 26th of April 1940. It is now bitterly cold. The time is 1:30 a.m. I have just come in from touring the skies with a locator. Our dog has been putting in quite a bit of barking tonight. Someone is hanging around and it causes us uneasiness. I put a few bullets in the magazine as it doesn't do to be caught napping here, and it will be a terrible pity for anyone I get moving along the skyline. It's no night for playing about with us, as we are browned off with no sleep, cold and with far less of anything to eat. Our French comrades are all asleep. Their telephone rings every night at approximately 11 p.m. to tell them to alert off, so the Frenchies go to coucher. Across the land is just now the distant thunder of heavy artillery gunfire. We are all delighted. Surely the war will really commence at last. Now, almost 5 years later, on the 7th of March 1945, the Belfast Telegraph carried an educational piece on the topic of these historical links between Ulster and Belgium, in which the Lowlands country was described as the cockpit of Europe. Now, all historians, especially when they're talking about the Second World War, like to go back a bit, but I'm going to go back probably a little bit further than you might imagine. So we're going to start in the 1300s and work our way up. The presence of Belgian Army units in Northern Ireland appeals very much to the historic mind, as there were many links between the province of Ulster in the past and that gallant little country, the cockpit of Europe, whose hospitable people are so well known to both civilians and soldiers who have adjourned in that buffer state. When one surveys the ancient cities of that land, their art, architecture and medieval monuments, and peruses the time-faded tomes recalling many sanguinary battles fought on its fair terrain and horrible tortures inflicted on its innocent, non-martial inhabitants down the ages, one can appreciate more fully the story of a stirring and checkered history not equalled in Europe. Journals held by the Société de Manuation de Bruges confirm that Irish merchants had traded in the city there as early as 1387. Irish military figures like John O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, was a colonel with the Irish Army in Flanders. Hugh O'Donnell, Earl of Tyrconnell, was a page to the Infanta in Flanders. In June 1640, Owen Roe O'Neill was appointed governor of Arras, where he and a small garrison defended the city against a French army. And the same article continues. When he, that's Owen Roe O'Neill, when he had to capitulate under the pressure of great beleaguering force, his gallant men, with him at their head, were permitted to march out of the citadel with colours flying and drums beating as a mark of respect to their soldierly conduct. The final few months of the Second World War were also not the first in which Belgian soldiers had found themselves in Northern Ireland. During the War of Revolution, many Flemish soldiers had taken up arms in support of King William III. One unit known as the Flemish Troops of Light Horse was quartered between Kells and Ballymena up in County Antrim. They were very noticeable at the time in their red coats and bright blue breeches. By May 1690, these troops were at Moira in the malt kilns of Sir Arthur Rawdon, from where they moved on to Loch Brickland. And over 250 years later, Flemish-speaking soldiers would return to the same towns and the same villages for a much different reason, following a much different war. In the first half of 1945, the Belgian Army sought to reorganise and reform their national army. The Second World War was still underway at that stage in both Europe and the Pacific theatre, and while there was a possibility of entering combat against the Japanese, the Belgians were eager to take the fight to the Germans. The units formed of volunteers and former militia troops became known as the Irish Brigades. The plans for this dated back to June 1943, and those plans were to raise 18 battalions after the liberation of Belgium. By October 1944, the Belgian government in exile in London had recruited volunteers for 12 rifle battalions, and after a short 6-week training programme, these volunteer soldiers equipped with light weapons would join British and American units. That was the 1st Infantry Brigade. Between January 1945 and June 1945, a further 5 Belgian infantry brigades, comprising of around 4,000 soldiers each, were raised. With Belgium still recovering from the ravages of war, and with many of the country's military installation in use by the British Army, it was decided to train these 5 new brigades in Northern Ireland. On the 1st of February 1945, the Londonderry Sentinel reported the upcoming arrival of this new wave of troops. In Belfast, the Newsletter and Northern Whig newspapers also carried the story. It had been almost a year since the departure of the bulk of the American soldiers from Northern Ireland, and their abandoned hutted camps would now house elements of this newly formed Free Belgian Army. 5 infantry brigades would group in Ulster under Belgian commanders and training staff, but the training methods and equipment would be those used by the British Army. Belfast-based newspapers noted that arrangements for Belgian welfare, recreation and medical care would be made ahead of their arrival. By the 5th of February 1945, the Belfast Telegraph indicated that the first Belgian soldiers had landed in Ulster. Headquarters for these new arrivals would be in County Antrim and County Down. Second, that was the Ulster Infantry Brigade of the Belgian Army, formed on the 19th of January 1945. They recruited their volunteers in Ronse-Oudenaarde in East Flanders. The first officers and NCOs had already trained in the United Kingdom during the Second World War, and between the 23rd of February 1945 and the 4th of February, the entire brigade shipped out to Northern Ireland under the command of Colonel Van Locke. The brigade underwent rigorous training during their time in Northern Ireland. Now, of those first troops who arrived with the 2nd Infantry Brigade, around 80% had already experienced combat during the Second World War. They had fought in underground resistance movements in German-occupied Belgium. And while they lacked the discipline and the proper military training of a regular army unit, their guerrilla tactics and sabotage activities had achieved good results and caused concern for the German military. By the time these still young men arrived in Ulster, they were battle-hardened, and many had narrowly escaped death at the hands of the enemy. Only weeks after their arrival, one of their officers spoke to a reporter from the Belfast Newsletter. The ambition of every one of them is to get into the fight on the continent as soon as possible. Most of them realised that, good as they were as guerrillas, they must have regular military training in order to be able to give the most effective help to our allies, and they are grateful for the opportunity which has been given to them. And most of those who arrived with that 1st Brigade were between 20 and 25 years old. There were, however, a number of older men, and among them were officers who had seen combat in the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Dressed in their British Army uniforms, the Belgians appeared happy to be in training, and after just a short time in Ulster, they had already begun to look healthier. One young trainee, speaking to the Belfast Newsletter, commented on his new diet. In our own country, we got plenty of food, such as potatoes, while the Germans were in occupation, but we suffered because the diet lacked variety. Now we're receiving plenty of good food. It will be a few weeks, however, before you see the effect on our physique after 4 years of shortage of fats. During their time in Belgium fighting with the resistance, these new soldiers had gained experience in many aspects of military procedure, including information gathering and, crucially, valuable experience in handling British weapons that had been dropped by parachute in occupied lands. The same soldier went on. We had built up a strong secret organisation under the nose of the enemy and were able to collect valuable information. Some of our members were women whose work was of great help. Within a short time of their arrival in Northern Ireland, the Belgians had begun to endear themselves to the locals, and they formed friendships quickly. Their wish was that everything would move with such great haste, and in particular that meant the arrival of letters and packages from home, but also their return to mainland Europe to take on the enemy. Those young Belgians training in Ulster had personal scores to settle. In the early stages of their training, they permitted local reporters to visit their camps. On the 12th of March 1945, a journalist with the Belfast Telegraph visited an unnamed camp, which provided a really unique glimpse into life in Ulster for the Belgians. He wrote, "Life for these youngsters has lost all meaning except this, retribution. That is why they are in Ulster now. They are praying in a foreign language, and their prayer is something like this: O God, may this war last a little longer. May it last long enough until we can strike the Boche back." And most of these young men were an absolute sorry sight when they departed their towns across liberated Belgium. They were dressed in threadbare civilian clothes. just rags hanging from undernourished frames. Many of them sported cardboard wrapping around their feet to patch holes and missing soles of worn-out boots and shoes. They had all suffered greatly at the hands of the occupying Nazi forces. They'd been beaten, they'd been tortured, they'd endured hardships which few in Northern Ireland could ever have imagined. Soon after their arrival in Ulster, they received an issue of pre-worn British battle dress, to which they added their own finishing touches. They held British weaponry in their hands, and their rigorous training regime began. On arrival at these camps, those journalists who were permitted entry may have easily mistaken the men for British soldiers, but this notion would soon be dispelled. The camps had in most cases previously seen occupation by the British Army and the American military. Now they sported new paintwork in the colours of the Belgian flag, and as the men lined up on the field, their shoulder flashes displayed Belgique on a crimson background. On their sleeves was the red, gold and black tricolour of their nation, and other brigades, such as the 5th American Infantry Brigade, wore cloth flashes denoting their particular military heritage. Their branding was a hunter horn on a background of emerald green. Much thought was given to how this new army would portray itself, and in some units, senior officers took it upon themselves to draw up their own new crests and insignia. During their time in Ulster, at Kirkcassock House near Magherlin, headquarters of the 1st Belgian Infantry Division, adopted the formation badge of the Northern Ireland District. That is a white 3-barred Irish gate with flanking pillars on a green background. An alternate formation badge occasionally worn was that of British troops in Northern Ireland, which was a red 3-barred Irish gate on a black background. This was worn along with the shoulder title, the word Belgium in black against a red background. Eventually, though, the Belgian Army created their own formation badges. They continued to use the white 3-barred Irish gate with flanking pillars. However, also on this design was a diamond shape featuring the black, yellow and red of the Belgian flag in the upper and lower sections. During the 2nd Brigade's early tenure in Northern Ireland, Colonel Van Locke held a competition among his men to design a new formation badge. The winning design was selected and manufactured in Great Britain. On a black shield, it included a yellow heraldic lion facing to the left in front of a red letter Y. Beneath the lion was a shamrock, symbolising their formation in Northern Ireland. Now, you might remember that this talk was titled Golden Shamrocks, and I realise I've got this far in with absolutely no context for that at all. So this is why. The first delivery of badges didn't actually have a green shamrock. They were yellow or gold. And Colonel Loop, commanding officer of 4th Steenstrata Infantry Brigade, wrote to the Belgian Ministry of Defence explaining that he and his men would be ridiculed and laughed out of Northern Ireland if seen wearing a yellow shamrock. So very soon, a new shipment of badges with proper green shamrocks arrived. On the 15th of June 1945, the Belgian Minister of Defence ordered all brigades to wear a more consistent formation badge, and each brigade's design would be based on that of the Ulster Brigade. Training was delivered by young British Army recruits under the watchful eye of Belgian officers. Although many of the Belgians had experience in combat, in Northern Ireland they were here to learn the British Army way. Often the demonstrators were youthful soldiers of only 17 or 18 years old. Now, they had not necessarily seen combat, but as relatively new recruits themselves, their training was fresh and their fitness was evident. Belgian soldiers watched demonstrations of physical training exercises, small arms fire, machine gun exercises, mortar drills, field work and unarmed combat. The Belgians watched closely, watched these young British soldiers, and they took everything in with a stern military resolve until the unarmed combat section. The Belfast Telegraph reporter takes up the story again. Then into the picture strutted a German. He was in the field grey of the Wehrmacht with jackboots, coal scuttle helmet and Prussian manner complete. Instinctively the Belgians reacted. A murmur ran through the parade, a murmur which swelled to a roar as the Boche was sent flying by his unarmed victim. "Ah," they exclaimed, fairly dancing with excitement. Even the commandant, a dignified man with a monocle, permitted himself a smile. His English was not so good, but he could express himself precisely. That, he said, is the part we like best, where we take him by the throat. I'll refrain from doing all the Belgian accents, but you can imagine that said by a Belgian officer. The language itself would play a crucial yet really complex part of the Belgians' time in Ulster. Within the camps and the barrack squares, familiar orders rang out, but they were in an unfamiliar French. Garde à vue brought the men to attention on Place Repos for standing at ease, and Rompe signalling the dismissal. A curious mix of French, Flemish, Dutch and Northern Irish English would mark these few months, sometimes with an air of comedy. From the arrival of the first contingent of Belgians, much of the local press focused on the difficulties faced by overseas troops when it came to language. One writer in the Belfast newsletter on the 27th of February 1945 was particularly scathing, but his remarks were on local people's grasp of other non-native languages. The people of these islands have long been considered to be among the world's worst linguists, by reason, it is said, of our insularity, which cuts us off in measure from the people of the continent. I wonder will this be true any longer of Ulster, since our association with the various overseas forces units. Already most of us are bilingual, we know both English and American. But at the present time, residents in a County Antrim town are fast adding a smattering of yet another language to their accomplishments. Among the first to pick up bits of French were County Antrim shopkeepers and tradespeople. Many journalists too found themselves attempting to converse with the Belgian soldiers in whatever broken French they had. One wrote, "In this town I had an opportunity the other night to brush up on my French, which I found most of the soldiers spoke as fluently as Flemish. The experience was a humiliating one, but I did manage to enunciate a question or two. To my surprise, the answers came in a language I knew better. Okay," replied the Belgians. Now, in Lenadurg Post Office, out near Banbridge in County Down, the Martin family had carried on business for many years. More than 50 years after the Belgians' time in County Down, then owner Roy Martin recounted an interesting scene that played out in his shop in 1945. Language barriers can create problems, but often they will prompt imaginative solutions. One afternoon, a young Belgian soldier asked Roy's mother in French for an egg. Her lack of understanding of the French word œuf was overcome when the soldier proceeded to perform an interesting impression of a hen laying an egg. Eggs were rationed at the time and there were none on the shelves, but Roy's mother was so amused by the young Belgian soldier's effort that she gave him one from her own kitchen. Now, not all shopkeepers and soldiers had such amiable relations. Annie Allen, a grocer from High Street in Antrim, was fined £8 at the local petty sessions for selling oranges at a price exceeding the allowed maximum. On the 15th of March 1945, Constable Williamson had observed a number of Belgian soldiers going into her store and coming back out with small bags of oranges. As something sparked this police officer's interest and he returned to the shop accompanied by a Belgian soldier. There he found that Mrs. Allen had overcharged by more than 10 shillings. Witnesses were called and evidence was analysed as the sessions concluded that Annie, despite not having weighed the oranges at all, had overcharged by a considerable amount. Mr. Mills, the district magistrate, concluded, "It was a particularly mean form of offence to take advantage of and exploit foreign soldiers in this way." Inevitably, language issues would arise, though, and with the arrival of thousands of young Belgian soldiers, most of them would speak French, some Flemish and some Dutch, while few had a smattering of English. As noted on the 24th of February 1945 in the Ireland Saturday Night newspaper, however, the language barrier wasn't always an obstacle. The writer there writes, "I have come to the conclusion that in the kingdom of romance the language barrier has ceased to operate. The thought came to me a few nights ago when I saw a number of young Belgian recruits arm in arm with an equal number of girls in Royal Avenue, Belfast. The boys were evidently up on leave from their camps in the country and had lost no time in securing female companions. What attracted me in the first instance was the mixture of foreign and familiar articulations. I heard such endearing words as belle, beaulieu, with gestures which might be seen on Flemish or French ground, but rarely here. Then, from the medley of the sound of the Ulster dialect was recognised in phrases such as, "And how do you like Antrim?" or "Are the girls here as nice as in your own country?" Whether they understood each other or whether their eyes were more eloquent than words, I cannot say, but these lovers seemed to vibrate in merriment and happiness and understanding. They were not looking interpreters. Just don't get journalism like that locally anymore. Now, that was one of many instances reported on when romantic interests were noted in the streets. The young soldiers, despite their occasional lack of English, were a sociable bunch, and they spent many, many hours in bars, cafes and dance halls. Local people grew to enjoy their company, and hundreds of events were laid on during their short stay in Ulster. Like those previously mentioned young ladies on Royal Avenue, many who had not swooned at the more brash swagger of the American GIs found themselves enamoured by the continental mystique and polite charm of the visiting Belgians. On the 19th of May 1945, Eldon O'Brien recounted an amusing tale in Ireland's Saturday Night. On VE Day, I witnessed an incident which illustrated the appeal of these boys from Flanders. They were out in strength and each had a girl companion. Around one particular blushing Belgian Romeo, I noticed a crowd. It was a tensely excited group, and my natural curiosity brought me to the fringe of the scene. My surprise can be imagined when I find two girls wanting the same soldier and urging their claims with feminine vehemence. As a matter of fact, I never saw two jealous combatants more aggressive, and I pitied the poor soldier laddie who was the innocent cause of the commotion. The sequel was amusing. At the most dramatic stage of the controversy, another girl arrived and whisked off the soldier, their exit being followed with scornful looks from the rivals who originally sought his companionship. The locals in the cities, towns and villages across Northern Ireland were well used to seeing the Belgians on the street. When not embracing that famous Irish hospitality, they could often be seen on parade, and one very memorable occasion was the 21st of July 1945. That was the commemoration of the Belgian National Day of Independence. Now, one of the largest gatherings on that day was here in Lisburn. Over 300 officers and men of the 6th Infantry Brigade assembled at the brigade's headquarters at Fort House. Under the command of Captain P. Angelin, they paraded from there to the War Memorial in Castle Street. There, a Major J. Smesman led a wreath on behalf of the Belgian Army. At such occasions across Northern Ireland, the Belgians made it very, very clear how much admiration and respect there was for those Ulstermen who had fought and died in Belgium's defence during both World Wars. After a bugler played the last post, a minute's silence was observed before a second wreath was laid on behalf of the 4th Infantry Brigade. A large crowd then watched the parade as it passed through Lisburn. At Market Square, the Urban Council had erected a base from where the Belgian and British flags flew. Major J. Smesman took the salute, accompanied by Captain Martins and other military officers from both Belgian and British units. Also present were Mr. A.N. Stevenson, the Vice Chairman of Lisburn Urban Council, Mr. T.H. MacDonald, the Town Clerk, Lieutenant Colonel J.G. Johnson, President of the Lisburn branch of the British Legion, Captain R.T. Hamilton, County Inspector, and Captain W.F. Creary, District Inspector. Now, there's no written record of any of the speeches that were given that day in Lisburn, but at the equivalent parade in Lurgan, Major Jacques addressed the crowd. With piety today, we remember our brothers in arms that by the sacrifice of their lives made it possible for our people and for us to celebrate this feast day. Our thoughts go also to all the valiant people that together with our Belgian soldiers, even the second time, shed their warm blood for the good cause. Let us all remain united as loyal and true comrades in arms under the folds of our Belgian tricolour. The social activities in Northern Ireland for the Belgians were more than just parades and pubs. There were moments of high culture too, such as a series of concerts presented by the Northern Ireland branch of CEMA. That is the Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, a forerunner of today's Arts Council of Northern Ireland. Mr. Jack Loudon was the organiser of a number of performances by Miss Eve Maxwell-Light, a soprano, and Miss Joan Davies, a pianist. With many performances for the Belgian troops, there would often be a focus on music, especially classical music, or on slapstick comedy and visual humour, Both of these required very little understanding of English from the soldiers. There was no such difficulties in the performances of Miss Maxwell Light, however. She performed in French to troops in Lisburn Orange Hall. French was one of the 13 languages in which this singer was proficient. The well-received show was the final performance of her short tour, and it was attended by equal numbers of local music fans and Belgian soldiers. Miss Davies on piano played a Bach toccata and fugue, the main item in her recital, and once again, as on a previous performance in Lisburn, she delighted the audience with her brilliant technique and feeling the mood for the most interesting work. Of course, there were many other pursuits for the troops to enjoy, and on the 16th of June 1945, also here in Lisburn, they took part in a week called Holidays at Home, and the first all-cycling sports meeting held since the pre-war days took place in Wallace Park. Sports were a vital source of both fitness and fun for the Belgians based in Northern Ireland. Alfred Jacques, who we mentioned earlier, served in 5th Morecambe Infantry Brigade, and he wrote an absolutely incredible memoir of his time in Ulster. He included the following. Outside of duty hours, the troops were likely to experience moments of depression or to indulge in too much drinking, because in the canteen they would always find Guinness is good for you. So we were instructed to have something to do, especially on Saturdays and Sundays. We had to find interesting pastimes, so we thought of football. But on Sundays it was difficult to play because the local Protestants felt that it was desecrating the Lord's Day. We had the same difficulties with cinema. A letter published to the Lurgan Mail on the 4th of August 1945 supports Jacques' observations. Dear Sir, I was under the impression that organised games in Lurgan Park on Sundays were not permitted by the Urban Council. Judge of my surprise, therefore, when on a walk through the park on Sunday last, I saw two teams watched by upwards of 300 spectators, uniformed and civilian, contesting what was apparently a very exciting match. On inquiry, I learnt that the teams were composed of Belgian soldiers, representing Woodville and Silverwood camps. There seemed no doubt that the game was organised and not just a kick around, for both teams were properly attired in football kit and a referee had charge of the game. I'm sure the majority of Lurgan people would have no objections to these soldier visitors using the park during weekdays and would no doubt be interested in their games. It seems strange, however, that the Urban Council can overlook this breach of the bylaws, if it is such, and I think it is, when they are so careful to enforce what very many locals consider unnecessary restrictions as only one example, including the locking up of children's swings on Sundays. Yours, etc., fair play. Doesn't that just sound like someone who would post on Facebook now? The Belgians took part, obviously, in football, but also in cycling, swimming, athletics, and all manner of track and field pursuit. But it was football that was far and away the most popular pastime. As well as helping the soldiers keep up their fitness, it provided an opportunity for camaraderie, and some of the larger games actually provided an opportunity for great fundraising for organisations who were raising money for charities to help soldiers return home or who would assist with the reacclimatisation, is that the word, of prisoners of war. The hottest ticket in this short Belgian football season came in May of 1945 at Red Hall, Ballycarry in County Antrim, where a crowd of 2,000 spectators gathered to watch the Short and Harland Antiques play a hotly contested game against the Belgian Select 11. Former Irish international and Linfield FC player Joe Bambrick was the big draw, and the game proceeded as follows. Spectators were keen to see how the Belgians would shape up against the Irishmen, and they had not long to wait for this. Bonnet streaked across the wing and played beautifully for Windhoek to lodge the ball home in the 7th minute. Playing with great spirit, the Belgians showed more dash than skill, and Bennett was applauded for stopping a hot shot from De Kook. The Irish backs frequently employed offside tactics which curbed several dangerous raids. Eventually, Ireland settled down and gave a delightful exhibition of the finer points of the game. With half an hour gone, Wilkins centred for Bambrick to equalise. Early on the restart, Bambrick gave Ireland the lead, the ball being deflected into the net by an opponent. The Belgians fought back, Bonnet's climaxing a sparkling run by sending in a lightning shot, which Bennett pushed past an upright for a fruitless corner. Next minute, Windhoek lost a good chance by failing to connect with his head. An injury to Frome necessitated changes on the Irish team. but they continued to play the more constructive football, and a typical backheeler from Joe Bambrick enabled Priestley to register a third goal. A splendid game resulted in a win for Ireland by 3-1. And those are the two actual teams who played up on the screen behind me there. Now, although not related to sport or football in any way, I'd just like to briefly read another tiny little excerpt from Alfred Jacques' memoirs. It relates to a very particular Ulster tradition, and he's clearly been misinformed about a lot of the backstory here, but it's clearly something that had a profound impact on the young Belgian, and I'm sure you'll be able to work out what was going on. He wrote, "I haven't told you how superstitious people were in Ireland. So at any time of the night or day, groups of 5 or 6 people would bang on big drums hanging from a strap around their necks. They would use flexible sticks and beat the drum as hard as they could. They did this to hope to chase away evil spirits. They could sometimes be heard at night, but if you saw them in broad daylight, it was advisable not to look at them because they took themselves very seriously and would look upon you with an evil eye." Now, the Belgians may not have had the same superstitious beliefs as their new Irish friends and acquaintances, but they were quite a religious lot. And many churches across Ulster welcomed both Catholic and Protestant soldiers of the Belgian forces to services, and a padre from Flanders called Walter Marichal became a well-known face in pulpits across the country. Sadly, for both Belgian and local worshippers, some visits to churches were to celebrate the lives of young Belgians who lost their lives in Northern Ireland. Many service personnel had died in Ulster during the Second World War. Many were victims of training accidents. In the case of the United States, military deaths were caused by accident, illness, air crashes, and murder, amongst other causes. When analysing the deaths of Belgian soldiers, some died as a result of illness, but overwhelmingly the main contributor was road traffic collisions. Whether it was the handling of larger, faster British military vehicles, or the twists and turns and hidden dips of Ulster roads, or perhaps simply the confusion of driving on the opposite side of the road, there were a great number of vehicular accidents during the Belgian Army's short time in Ulster. One such incident occurred on the Lurgan Road between Lisburn and Lurgan. A Belgian Army lorry collided with a milk van driven by a 35-year-old called Joseph Cunningham from Pomeroy in County Tyrone. The lorry was extensively damaged in the crash, and Cunningham was taken to the County Antrim Infirmary in Lisburn with head injuries. Other victims of collisions, such as Ballymena man Charles Manson, were not so fortunate. He succumbed to his injuries and died following a road traffic collision with a Belgian Army lorry in Portadown. As mentioned, Belgians too lost their lives. One such case is that of Private Edwin Morris Pinkers. He was 19 years old, native of Liège, and serving in the field ambulance section of 4th Steenstrata Infantry Brigade at his time of death. The inquest that followed provided an insight into the issues faced by these young men when in charge of large vehicles in a strange land. The events of the tragic afternoon were as follows. An ambulance driven by Private Paul Jemani was towing a broken-down truck driven by Private Jean de Fournay from the Belgian camp at St. Patrick Rectory towards the main road. On the seat behind Jemani sat the unfortunate Pinkers. He was looking backwards to see if and when the truck's engine would start. After travelling around 200 yards, the broken-down truck's engine turned over and Jemani stopped the vehicle. A military lorry approached from behind. Pinkers jumped down from the ambulance into the road. Private Jacques Driessen, who was a passenger in the broken-down truck, picked up the narrative. As both vehicles were stopping, the deceased jumped off the ambulance on the right-hand side and was looking towards my truck when a 3-ton Belgian lorry suddenly appeared from the Lurgan direction. It struck the deceased, the right front wheel passing over him. Owing to the ambulance in front of me, I had no view of the lorry until it appeared abreast of me. On hearing shouts, Jemani looked towards the lorry and he saw the body of Pinkers lying beneath the vehicle between the front and rear wheels. Private Francis Courcelle, the driver of the lorry, was the final witness called. He stated that he saw the Belgian soldier and he believed he was aware of the approaching lorry. Courcelle sounded his horn and applied the brakes, perhaps a little later than he should have, and struck Pinkers, who did not move from the road. The injured Belgian was taken immediately to the base hospital, but died minutes after arrival. A tragic end for a young man who had already come through so much. The happier times, however, far outweighed the tragic during the Belgians' brief time here in Northern Ireland, and there was no greater cause for celebration than VE Day, the 80th anniversary of which we will soon be celebrating ourselves. And Lisburn played a key part in how the Belgians celebrated. A report in the Lisburn Standard from the 11th of May 1945 read, "First indication that the unconditional surrender of all German forces had been signed came to Lisburn on Monday, when word got around that a standby announcement had been made on the radio for 4 p.m. that afternoon. Many of the citizens immediately went to their radio sets, but the time passed without the hoped-for news." The Monday in question was the 7th of May, and that evening, the meeting of the Urban Council was interrupted at 7:45 p.m. by a phone message to the town clerk, Mr. T.H. MacDonald. The message was that at 3 p.m. the following day, Prime Minister Winston Churchill would announce VE Day, and that day and the next would be declared public holidays. Shortly afterwards, Air Raid Warden Mr. R.H. Gibson broadcast the news across Market Square, and those passing soon spread it throughout the whole town. And so, VE Day celebrations started a night early in Lisburn, as well as in many other towns and villages across Ulster as word began to spread. Crowds gathered in the street, and the Belgian soldiers based at Fort House paraded all the way to Dunmurry and back before marching on to Knockmore. All the while they sang "It's a Long Way to Tipperary" and other songs from both World Wars. On their return they lit an impromptu bonfire at Seymour Street. They produced a melodeon and continued the music and dancing into the wee small hours of the morning. Similar exuberance was shown in Larne, Ballyclare, Points Pass, Guildford, Tandragee and all other towns close to Belgian bases. But VE Day was not a wholly joyous occasion that we imagine for all. In Portadown, one young man felt so left out of the celebrations that he took to writing into the newspaper in the days that followed. "Dear Sir, would you allow me space in your paper for these few lines? On Monday night when I was in Portadown, when there was celebration in the streets, and as an Ulster soldier home on leave after 4 years of war, Dunkirk, Sicily, Italy, I tried to join in the fun, but the girls had no time for me. It was all for the Americans and the Belgians. Live and let live. I am yours truly, a Portadown soldier." Behind the singing, the dancing, the bonfires, the merriment, many could not fully bring themselves to enjoy the occasion. Many people in local communities had lost loved ones. Many awaited news of missing family members and prisoners of war. And for the Belgian soldiers, there was the memory of all that they had lost back home and a real desire to get back to Belgium to exact some sort of revenge in occupied Germany, because that is where the bulk of the Belgian troops were next bound. By early December 1945, the very last remnants of the 6th Infantry Brigade, the very last to leave, had gone. It had been 10 short months since the ragtag band of Belgian teenagers making up 2nd Infantry Brigade had arrived in their threadbare clothing, all excited to take on their Nazi oppressors. Much had changed in that short time. The Belgians' short stay in Ulster had seen them witness historic moments from VE Day through the death of world leaders Roosevelt and Hitler to the detonation of the atomic bomb and the surrender of the Japanese forces. The Second World War was at an end, but already a new war, the Cold War, was brewing. After a short stint training in England, the Belgian units mostly returned to continental Europe as a fully formed army to serve in Allied-occupied Germany. A trawl through newspapers and official documentation of the time suggests that the Belgian stay in Northern Ireland was a totally delightful all-round experience, from the parades to the girls to the football and the many joyous occasions marked throughout 1945. There were too, as we have seen, however, moments of tragedy and loss. Some young Belgian soldiers would sustain injuries here that would end their military careers before they began. Others would be even less fortunate and would lie in an Ulster grave until repatriation some years later. Some Belgian researchers suggest that the period from February to December 1945 was far from idyllic for these young Belgians. They note the lack of proper equipment and uniform, the poor quality food, and the gloomy weather. An official Belgian archive website states that there were many clashes between the Belgian soldiers and the local population, although this doesn't play out at all in the local press in the same way it did when frequent altercations did take place between locals and American GIs. The truth, it's safe to say, probably lies somewhere in between. Each soldier would have had a totally different experience, and it's only through further research of war diaries or memoirs written by Belgian soldiers and locals alike that we will be able to understand that wider picture. I don't know if you can make out that picture, actually. It's quite hard to do, but it is graffiti that has been left on a tree on Rans Island, and it says across the middle there, Belgium. It was carved into that tree in 1945, and someone from Rans Island Heritage Project very kindly sent me a photo of that a couple of years ago, and I actually believe that the long line along the bottom says Steenstrata, which was the 4th Infantry Brigade's nickname. So that is the Belgians literally leaving their mark on Northern Ireland. And much is made of the time spent here by Polish airmen and American GIs, but the story of the Belgians over the years has become all but forgotten. From the 1960s to the 1990s, however, Belgian veteran groups were frequent visitors to the province, but as those old soldiers pass on, so too does the memory. By the mid-1990s, as we marked the 50th anniversary of VE Day, there was a great amount of misinformation published in the local press. Reports of 6,000 Belgian troops in Ulster greatly underplayed the significance of the actual 20,000 plus. Some newspapers suggested an incredibly poorly researched timeline suggesting that the Belgians in Ulster departed for D-Day and Normandy. Well, they certainly did not. Most of those who would find themselves in Ulster a year after D-Day were operating in dangerous underground resistance units at the time as the Allies advanced in 1944. Another great misconception was the role actually played by Belgium in the war. In March 1995, an unnamed woman wrote to the Lurgan Mail in disgust that a regional council event was to honour Belgian ex-servicemen. She wrote, "All they want to do is entertain a lot of Belgians who didn't do much for us during the war. They capitulated to the Germans, and instead of scuttling their boats and destroying their ammunition, they walked away and left the whole lot to Hitler with a knife and fork." This talk this evening just marks the very start of my research into this topic. And that's why I've been reading quite a lot of my notes. This is an entirely new project for me, and I was worried that I might not get enough words to do a 45-minute talk, and I'm now seriously considering a whole series of podcasts and possibly a book, because this is scratching just the very surface of it. From the research I've done so far, I could probably have talked here for 3 or 4 hours, but you'll want to get out and enjoy a little bit of the daylight that's left. What I do hope is that this evening has gone some way towards showing you what many Belgians endured during the war, the horrors of the occupation that they came through, and their real desire to get back into the fight, their eagerness to return to Belgium and reclaim their country. And as we mark this 80th anniversary, perhaps it is time to reach out, to engage with that history, and once again strengthen those historic links that we mentioned right back at the very start. And if anyone has any questions or would like to talk to me more about the Belgians, I'm happy to do so. And thank you very much.
The Belgians were really overrun at the beginning of the war. There was no fight at all with the soldiers. They were just a terrible time they had, but they didn't show any resistance at all to the Germans at the start of the Second World War, 1940.
Yeah, I think the kind of fight back was somewhat limited, but I mean you could say that about the French as well, who had like a great, but they had a much better army and infrastructure than the Belgians would have had. I think it was the shock and awe and the surprise and the speed of the German advance really just took all of those nations by surprise.
Any more questions? Yourself?
It's all right.
Are you sure?
Yeah. You mentioned those who were killed being buried here but subsequently repatriated. Were they buried in any particular place, or?
Mostly from what I've found, either in Belfast City Cemetery or Milltown, depending on their religion. I haven't found any evidence of kind of more rural burials, but I'm going through newspaper archives, so I'm kind of uncovering incidents as I go along. But yeah, certainly it's been in Belfast City Cemetery and Milltown so far. and they were all repatriated, I believe, in the early 60s.
Great. Well, we'll wrap it up there. If you have any questions, I'm sure, Scott, you'll maybe not be running off immediately. So if you have anything, please come up to Scott. Thank you, everyone.